Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Tuesday to you. Hopefully you're having a great day so far. A very hot and humid one out there. Man, I had a hard time getting my camera this morning to be able to defog because of all of the humidity out there, and there's some significant humidity going on right now. Temperatures have been holding around 91 degrees with a heat index of 103, and it looks like that heat advisory is going to stay in place until 7 o'clock later on tonight. Real quick check of the traffic cams here just to look at the skies for the most part. We've got a mix of sun and clouds out there. No rain across the Acadiana area right now, but there are a few widely scattered showers picking up on the radar here over southeastern portion of Louisiana. I don't know if you knew this or not, but the National Weather Service radar that was over in Slidell is currently being moved to Hammond, which would cover the New Orleans and the Baton Rouge area a little bit better, and then the eastern parts there, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, are going to be handled more by the Mobile radar. But just recently, we have managed to get some data here from this particular radar. Hopefully that's something that we're going to be seeing continuously here over the next several weeks as they get that particular radar in place. We'll check the Lake Charles radar here real quick. Again, there's not a whole lot going on in the immediate Acadiana area right now. A couple of isolated showers will keep the rain chance today at about 30%. So let's go ahead and move along as promised, so that when you hang around the water cooler at work later today or into tomorrow, I'm going to try to make you sound a little bit smarter when it comes to types of tropical weather. But we're going to talk about the West African Monsoonal Trough. And what we have is during the winter time, which is summertime in the southern hemisphere here on this side, you get the intertropical convergence zone, and that's basically where the northern hemisphere's winds and the southern hemisphere's winds kind of collide, and you get convergence, and it's called the intertropical convergence zone, or the ITCZ is what it's also known as. But during the winter time, you get a pretty good flow from the Indian Ocean, bringing some rains to southern portions of Africa, and in the summertime, during hurricane season, that intertropical convergence zone, as you can see here, moves much farther to the north, and what you get is more of an onshore flow here off the Atlantic Ocean. You get the dry air flow coming off of the deserts there, and you sometimes can get low pressure that will develop over Western Africa and then start to make its way out to sea into the Atlantic Ocean, eventually becoming a tropical wave. So this is a pattern that we tend to see as we get June through September. You get those big thunderstorm complexes that kind of roll off the African coast and eventually become tropical waves out in the Atlantic basin, and eventually those can sometimes become a tropical system. So that's what's called the West African Monsoonal Trough. So there you go. You can learn a little bit more about that if you want to Google it, but I just gave you kind of a briefing on there so you can hang out with your friends and sound really smart with using these great big words like intertropical convergence zone. So intertropical convergence zone is actually able to be seen pretty well here on the Eastern Atlantic satellite. And again, you get those you get the winds that come in from the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and they meet right there in the intertropical convergence zone. And during the winter time, for us in the northern hemisphere, it goes way down here, and then during hurricane season, it can extend a little bit farther to the north up here, which is where we get some of our tropical waves. Right now, we got, again, one of those little troughs that's moving off the African coast, a tropical wave right here as it moves off toward the west, and it actually might have a little bit of a chance for some development here over the next couple of days. But we are watching also the Saharan dust. When I showed you that earlier graphic there, where you get the monsoonal flow, you get the onshore flow south of the intertropical convergence zone, and then you get that other warmer, drier air that starts to come off of the areas there off the Atlantic coast. And what it can do is it provides quite a bit of Saharan dust. And this is the latest image that we've got of the dust product. And there's quite a bit of it here over the Eastern Atlantic, which is generally common for late June and early July, and it is part of the responsibility of why we don't get as many tropical systems to develop late June and into early July, unless they're over here in the Gulf of Mexico in the western part of the Caribbean or the far western Atlantic. So with that dust in place, you are seeing really nothing developing. You got a wave there, and you've got a wave out here, and you've got a fairly strong tropical wave that's south of some of that Saharan dust now over the Atlantic. But we'll watch the Saharan dust. It tends to choke developing tropical systems, so that's why we look at those things. Let's look at the big picture here of the Atlantic satellite, and as the daylight kind of rolls around, you see some of the browner shades that are out here over the eastern part of the Atlantic. That is some of that Saharan dust, and it rotates there north of a tropical disturbance or something that we're really watching. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, as it was a fairly vigorous tropical wave east of the Leeward and Windward Islands, brought a lot of heavy rain to the southern Windward Islands and Trinidad and Tobago as well. And this is going to continue to kind of cruise off toward the west. Sometimes you get flare-ups of thunderstorms along these tropical waves, and that's what's happening right now. It doesn't look like anything real significant, but it has caught the attention of the National Hurricane Center, with the potential for some development several days down the road as it moves into the western part of the Caribbean Sea and into the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, namely the Bay of Campeche, which has been quite active with our first tropical system, Alberto, that spun up early last week, and then there was the potential for something to spin up early this weekend. That fortunately did not happen, but unfortunately Central America and much of Mexico continuing to get some very heavy rain due to those systems. So let's go ahead and take a closer view at the Caribbean. And again, this tropical wave here, big flare-up of thunderstorms. It is moving fairly rapidly off to the west at about 15 to 20 miles per hour. High pressure's in control out here a little bit farther to the west here over the western part of the Caribbean, with the exception of a bit of a tropical wave or a monsoonal type of trough that rolls off the South American coast, which would be the South American monsoonal trough, very similar to what you see over the African trough. You got more upper level energy up here, generating some showers, some thunderstorms from the Bahamas moving northeastward. So as far as any development in the near term, probably not going to see a whole lot. There's a couple of reasons why. This is the shear map for right now, and you can see where that trough is way down here to the south. It is working with quite a bit of wind shear, and there's quite a bit of wind shear in its path as well. But what's quite different from what we saw last week is there's virtually no wind shear now over the central and the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico, with some moderate wind shear over the western part. So if we were to see anything in this particular area, we would be quite worried because of the low wind shear, and then on top of that, you've got the very high water temperatures. But let's go ahead and fast forward, looking at the GFS model of wind shear, and we're taking this out to the midday hours of Sunday. And you can see that as this low, or this, let's say this tropical wave, tries to work its way off toward the west, unless it can run in tandem maybe with some of this higher wind shear that's north and also in the western part of the Caribbean, it's really not going to have much of a chance for any significant development because of the wind shear. It's very high here near the Yucatan, and by Sunday it's going to be pretty high over the western part of the Caribbean as well. And even up here in the Gulf of Mexico, we've got some fairly high wind shear, so I wouldn't expect anything to move in our general direction with this particular system. But there are a few things that are in its favor, and one of those is the water temperatures. You can see we're pretty much open for business in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, the western part of the Atlantic, and even the central and eastern part of the Atlantic, starting to get into that 27 or higher degree water, which is 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically anywhere can support a tropical system trying to develop, as long as the atmospheric conditions are favorable, which they are not right now. And another thing we look at is the tropical cyclone heat potential. This is the latest for today, and we have been really watching the area here across the Caribbean and the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico with some very high heat potential. And basically what this is premium fuel for tropical systems to work with. We measure the water temperature at the surface, but we also look to see how far down those 80-degree waters go below the surface. And the more 80-degree water below the surface, the higher the heat potential, and you can see that is a case in several areas areas here across the Caribbean Sea. Just to give you an example here, there's Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, South America down to the south, and there are the Leeward and Windward Islands. So this all right here is the Caribbean Sea, and this over here is the Gulf of Mexico, for reference, because I know this is kind of a gray, weird map. It's not a great map, but you've got a tremendous amount of heat potential over the western part of the Caribbean. So if anything over here wants to move in that general direction, we would be a little more concerned about the possibility of some tropical development. And also remember that high tropical cyclone heat potential can add to rapid development of a tropical system, or rapid intensification. And we've seen that happen several times before with some of the bigger hurricanes that have affected us here along the Gulf Coast. So we're going to look at a long-range model here, and this is the GFS that came down just a little while ago. And there's a huge ridge of high pressure that's currently out here over the Atlantic Ocean. So basically anything that develops from Africa is going to go on a westward track and continue on more of a westward track across the Caribbean as well, kind of rounding that big ridge of high pressure. If something were to try to develop, say, north of the Caribbean islands, I'd be more interested in worrying about the Atlantic seaboard, because everything will just kind of rotate around that big ridge of high pressure there over the Atlantic Ocean. So that's why we get a little more concerned when something wants to develop down here with that ridge of high pressure there. This would kind of round or possibly move off toward the northwest and could potentially get into the Gulf of Mexico. Although there's a fairly strong ridge of high pressure here that's going to be filtering in, so that might prevent anything from turning more northward toward the Gulf Coast. So let's look at the Euro model, and the Euro model ran very early this morning. The Euro model goes out 10 days every other run. So this is the 0Z that came down late last night, early this morning. And there are some indications maybe of a bit of a low pressure area developing over the parts of the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea. But I also want to point, as this goes out to July the 5th, there's a couple of other tropical waves that kind of try to get going here over maybe the western part of the Atlantic Ocean, or maybe even in parts of the Caribbean Sea as well. It is indicating something trying to get going here near the Yucatan Peninsula in association with the low that's right here. But if you'll also notice, there's a couple of other areas that kind of catch your eye. Watch this area here as we get into the last few days of June and the early part of July. You'll see a low pressure area developing there and moving off toward the west. So again, as we get into July, there's that little bit of a low, but I would think, again, if anything developed there, it would probably rotate around that ridge of high pressure and head toward either the Atlantic coast or curve around and go back out to sea. So there is some potential. Again, the models don't seem to be too turned on by any of this stuff that's out there, and the National Hurricane Center is putting a 20% or less chance for development sometime in the next several days. But it is basically the only thing we have to look at out there, other than the possibility of a couple of tropical waves that might have a chance over the central and western portion of the Atlantic Ocean later this week and into the weekend. Anything else to worry about? Really not much. Here's the Central American satellite. And again, you're seeing kind of the northern edge of that tropical wave that's there right around the coast of Colombia, and that's generating some showers and thunderstorms over the far southwestern portion of the Caribbean Sea. And in the Gulf of Mexico, we really don't have a lot to worry about here either. Everything is clear across the central part of the Atlantic. Got a few thunderstorms off the Louisiana coast. Got a little bit of thunderstorm activity off the Florida coast, and then down here in the Bay of Campeche, some thunderstorms there too. But really nothing to really get excited about. Kind of a ridge of high pressure that's out here over the eastern part of the Gulf is really sending those warm, moist air masses right toward the Louisiana coast, and that's why we've been seeing our dew points running in the mid to upper 70s, keeping it very, very muggy across Acadiana. Now, as we move into July, a lot of times we see a little less coverage of tropical activity. Some of that has to do with the drier air and the Saharan dust. Now, the Saharan dust really starts to cut off maybe about July 15th or something like that. And that's when we start to get that climb on our hurricane activity. Everything that's in the red here is hurricanes and tropical storms together, and you can see we get quite a few hurricanes as we start to approach the peak of the season there on September the 10th. But you do definitely get a little bit of an uptick here toward the second half of July, going through August, then pushing into September, and then it drops off a bit. But here in Louisiana, we sometimes get a little peak there during the month of October, and we have already seen that a number of times. Hurricane Lily was one back in 2001. You had Hurricane Delta back in 2020. So you do get some tropical systems that can linger on into the latter part of the hurricane season. So not much to talk about. Couple of tropical waves that we'll be watching. And again, as you watch this each and every day, you'll get a better idea of the trends. And we, as meteorologists, like to look at trends based on computer models, multiple runs of the same computer model. And we also look at climate over the course of a season, where we tend to think that activity gets a little bit more exciting as we get into August and September. Well, I do hope that you enjoy our midday lunch chats here on Let's Talk Tropics. If you do, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends too, and also turn on those notifications. That way you'll know when Let's Talk Tropics runs again on Wednesday or early tomorrow morning if you want to catch Acadiana weather today, which is just a morning forecast, a basic backyard weather forecast on what the weather's doing and how it's going to affect your day. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Again, I hope you have a great Tuesday. Try to stay cool, and I will see you on Wednesday.